School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Mexico has recently acquired a reputation as a rather violent country, with gang wars and shootouts with police becoming near daily affairs. That's nothing compared to the violence against women in Mexico. According to the country's National Citizen Femicide Observatory, 6 women are killed every day in the country. But despite these shocking numbers, only 24% of what some are calling femicides were investigated. And just 1.6% of those cases actually led to a conviction and sentencing from 2012 to 2013. So what is being done about what some are calling an epidemic of violence against women in Mexico? We'll talk with an economist who has been researching the phenomenon and made some surprising findings. But first, we'll hear from 2 reporters in the Mexican city of Guadalajara that have been following this story. Joining us from Guadalajara are Stephen Woodman, a staff writer for the Guadalajara Reporter, and Duncan Tucker, a freelance journalist who is a contributor to Al-Jazeera English and other news outlets. Welcome to both of you. Duncan Tucker, describe for our listeners how this phenomenon has emerged in Mexico and sort of where it is today.
Sure. So this first began in the mid-1990s in the city of Ciudad Juarez on the U.S Mexican border, where you had a lot of vulnerable young women who were going to work in difficult labor conditions in these factories known as maquiladoras. And many of them moved there on their own from the south, so they had very little protection. And there were many cases of these women being killed and found strangled or tortured or raped and that kind of thing. But at that time, it was still very much a kind of local phenomenon. But in recent years, it's kind of spread to other parts of the country, like Mexico State is particularly bad for it in the center of the country. Jalisco, here in Jalisco is where we are, is pretty bad. And it's really become something that's affecting more and more of Mexico as it's gone by.
Stephen Woodman, you work for the Guadalajara Reporter. Tell us about how you got interested in reporting on this subject.
It was actually because of an emblematic case in Guadalajara, which is the city I live, and it actually involved a friend of a friend, Imelda, who was an extremely peaceful person, a psychologist, a yoga teacher, and someone who rescued stray dogs from the street. She was in her car with her husband when 2 men forced their way into the vehicle, and she was taken to an abandoned lot and was raped and beaten to death. When the police arrived, they questioned her husband, and they found that there were various contradictions in his version of events. And eventually he buckled under pressure and confessed that he'd hired these men to murder his wife in exchange for a car and a payment of 50,000 pesos, which is not much money. It's a little under $4,000. So that was when I first started really focusing on this.
Sadly, men kill women around the world every day in a variety of countries. So what is different about this phenomenon in Mexico?
It's the scale of the phenomenon. As you mentioned, there are lots of statistics that show that it's a wide-scale problem in Mexico. And it's also that it seems to be growing. It seems to have doubled in the past 6 years. So that's really why it's attracting a lot of attention.
And Duncan Tucker, so tell us, is this term femicide, is it akin to sort of what in the United States we would call a hate crime then, and just instead of one of the motivating factors for a killing or a murder, instead of it being sexual orientation or race or religion, in this case it's gender? Is that one way to think about this?
Yeah, I think one of the best definitions I've found is from the feminist scholar Diana Russell, who was one of the pioneers of the term femicide. And she defines it as the murder of women by men motivated by hatred, contempt, pleasure, or a sense of ownership of women.
And give us, if you would, some examples of specific crimes that you've covered that would fall under this definition.
Well, actually, the case that Steve mentioned, the Imelda Virgen case, is one of the most emblematic ones here in Jalisco. I went and spoke to some of her family a few weeks ago, and one of the aspects of this case, which is quite typical of Mexico, is that it happened 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago now, but it's still been no resolution of the case. The people have been arrested, but there's been no trial. And if you look at some of the femicides in Mexico, only 1.6% have resulted in convictions in the last few years. And that's of only 16% of female homicides are actually classed as femicide. So it's an even smaller proportion of the total number of cases. And something that sticks out again in this Imelda case is that it happened 2 or 3 days after the femicide was established in law as a separate crime. But the case still hasn't actually been defined as a femicide. And lots of activists and her family are particularly upset that the government doesn't recognize it for what it is, which is a case of, well, violence against a woman motivated by this kind of sense of ownership of women.
Stephen Woodman, Duncan Tucker had just mentioned that femicide has been classified as a separate crime in Mexico after this case involving Imelda. Tell us, what does that mean in a practical sense?
In a practical sense, it means that the authorities are applying a gender perspective to their investigations. So they're saying that these women are murdered because they are women, because they were women. So I think it's also useful to mention that femicide is a homicide that's motivated by hatred for women, as Duncan mentioned. There's another term that you sometimes come across, which is feminicide, which is different. It's a political term, and it has roots in the idea of genocide. So it means that this other term, feminicide, is making it a public rather than a private problem, and it's suggesting that the state and judicial structures are responsible for tolerating the problem. The legal term femicide is key to identifying the reasons for why these women were murdered. Feminicide is suggesting that the state is also involved in this crime.
Well, let me ask you, Stephen, you mentioned that one of the keys to prosecuting or identifying a crime as femicide is that you have to identify that the motive for the crime was hatred of women. That seems like that might be a difficult case to make in many cases, is it not?
I agree. Yes, it is. It is a difficult case to make. If you study some of the key cases, for example, this case we've mentioned already of Imelda Verdhin, it does follow a pattern of abuse and follows this pattern of sense of ownership of women that suggests that it was a crime that was influenced by the culture and influenced by this kind of hatred for women. So, for example, I don't think there was any physical violence from the husband of Imelda before her murder, but he made accusations, continually accusing her of infidelity and things like stalking her, stealing money. And after she went to live with her family, they were about to separate. Her husband poisoned her dogs while she was away. So it suggests that there is this sense of ownership, and it suggests that if she was a man, it would be different. It seems to be definitely important, the fact that she was a woman.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're talking today about violence against women in Mexico, specifically a rise in hate-motivated killings that some are calling femicide. We're joined from Guadalajara by Stephen Woodman, a writer for the Guadalajara Reporter, and Duncan Tucker, a freelance journalist who is a contributor to Al-Jazeera English and other news outlets. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. Duncan Tucker, we had mentioned earlier in the show there are statistics that show that just 1.6% of cases of homicide of women result in conviction and sentencing in Mexico. Why is the government response, or why is that rate so low?
Well, impunity is a major problem across Mexico in general. In fact, it was recently named the second worst country in the world in terms of impunity, according to one study. So, the culprits know, for one thing, that there's a 99% chance that they're going to get away with it, which is kind of a deterrent, which also contributes to the rise in violence, I think, to some extent. And then one of the major problems is the weak judicial system that Mexico has. So at the moment, they have this. They're gradually introducing a Western-style system of oral trials, but at the moment, most cases just involve a judge reviewing written evidence submitted by the prosecutors and the defendant, and then the judge makes a ruling based on that. But I think that's a particularly weak system weak justice system.
I understand that last November, December, January, when Mexican police were searching for the bodies of the students from the Ayotzinapa school in southwestern Mexico that went missing. There were 40-some students that went missing. They kept coming across a series of mass graves that turned out not to be the students, including one where that held something like 16 women. So when you hear about something like that, that's extremely disturbing, what are some possible explanations for why you might find a mass grave like that?
The sad truth is that's actually quite common. Here in Jalisco, a year or two ago, they found over 107 bodies near the border with the state of Michoacan. And I think it's even worse in some of the northern states like Coahuila. There's potentially hundreds or even thousands, according to some estimates, have disappeared and bodies out there. And it's just a case, I think, that the Mexican government tries to play down the violence that's happening here, and it tries to ignore it to some extent. And the case of the missing students put that pressure on the government and forced it to actually go out and look for these bodies. And what they found, obviously, was that this is a much deeper, much wider problem than anyone had previously recognized.
Stephen Woodman, I understand that Brazil had just recently passed a law that defines femicide, as you mentioned, any crime that involves domestic violence, discrimination, or contempt for women, which results in their death. And those convicted of femicide face longer prison sentences than they would sort of for a prosecution for murder. Several other countries in Latin America also have statutes about femicide. Tell us, is this something that Mexico is moving towards as a way to end this? You talked earlier that they are looking at reclassifying some crimes.
Yes, in fact, it's mostly the state governments who are responsible for the classification of crimes. And in Jalisco, I think Duncan mentioned briefly that 2 or 3 days before the death of Imelda Virgin, this emblematic case, the crime of femicide had been classified as a separate crime, and it was going to have longer penalties. But the police tend to avoid classifying crimes as femicide if they can classify them as a homicide.
Why is that?
They don't like to admit the scale of the problem, presumably, and perhaps it's easier for them to classify it as a crime that they're used to classifying. It's a new classification. Maybe they don't like applying a new classification to something. I'm not entirely sure, but they definitely are resisting this.
Now, Duncan Tucker, in our research for this show, we came across some varying explanations for why this phenomenon has emerged in Mexico over the last 15 to 20 years. There were a number of explanations, from rising income inequality to narco trafficking, police corruption, a culture of machismo. What factors do you see in society as being linked to a rise in hate killings of women?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think machismo is a deep-rooted aspect of Mexican culture that goes back centuries and has proven very difficult to eradicate. But I think you'd be oversimplifying the debate if you just blame it on machismo. So impunity, again, I mentioned, comes into it, this fact that there's very little deterrent to stop this kind of behavior. And then one of the biggest factors has been the drug war. It's caused a massive rise in violence in general and kind of desensitized young people to killing. And if you look at the statistics, Mexico's female homicide rate more than doubled from 1.9 murders per 100,000 women in 2006, which was the year that the government declared war on the drug cartels, and it rose to 4.6 murders per 100,000 women in 2012. So that's a massive rise in violence just during that short period when Mexico, well, the violence across Mexico in general exploded, but that's obviously affected women in a serious way as well.
And Stephen Woodman, generally, what is the reaction within communities when a crime like this occurs? Is this something that people become very active and agitated about, or is this sort of thing, is it sort of brushed off or tolerated in some way?
I think it's in some way tolerated by the authorities. There is definitely rising activism and awareness, which I'm hopeful can impact the problem. And you're seeing more public awareness campaigns by groups like Amnesty International. They had a very smart poster campaign about the incremental nature of violence, the way that these patterns of abuse often begin with just verbal insults, but can escalate into something extremely dangerous.
Duncan Tucker, you mentioned earlier some data on rising rates of killing of women in Mexico. What are some of the challenges in sort of obtaining data from the police and in obtaining data from the government on this? We reached out to Mexican government authorities on a number of occasions and had difficulty getting someone to come on the show to talk about this issue.
Yeah, it can be inconsistent, the government data, and I was actually investigating this recently, and I'd found some good statistics in the report from a government agency, and then I went back a few weeks later to double check, and the report was just no longer online anymore. They'd just taken it down for some reason. So you do sometimes have to rely on civic organizations, like I think you mentioned earlier, the National Observatory on Femicide has been a good source that works with different groups in a kind of coalition to keep track of the data that's happening here.
Stephen Woodman, Duncan had mentioned the National Observatory. What role has citizen activism and civil society groups played in highlighting this problem?
They play a key role, really. With regards to the case we've been mentioning, the Imelda Virgin case, there have been marches, and I think this contributes to a growing awareness of the problem, definitely. So across Mexico, you're seeing an increase in marches that are drawing attention to the problem, and an increase in activism, and NGOs are quite vocal about this problem as well.
Now, for another perspective on this issue, we're going to talk with Pedro Albuquerque. He's an associate professor at KEDGE Business School in Marseille, France. Previously, he was at Texas A&M University and has done crime research on border cities along the U.S. Mexico frontier. Pedro Albuquerque, welcome to Global Journalist.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
You've done some extensive research on this phenomenon. Tell us how you got interested in studying this.
Oh, this is an interesting story because I was born in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and as you know, Brazil is a country with relatively high crime rates. When I moved to Texas to teach in Texas, one of the first things that I observed, particularly because I was living in the Laredo campus, right at the border, one of the first things that came to my observation was how peaceful, in reality, how little crime there was in Laredo across the border, and on the other side of the border in Nuevo Laredo, criminality was very high. And I started thinking about it and looking at the phenomenon, trying to observe the factors that were at play. One thing that immediately struck me is the fact that both sides of the border basically have the same population makeup. Most people are of Hispanic origin. Laredo is close to 100%. So we are dealing then with a situation where culture is basically the same. And interestingly enough, the outcomes in terms of criminality are quite different. So the first study that I wrote on this subject was exactly to try to identify the main factors. So I investigated economic variables such as levels of income, inequality, and interestingly enough, in Laredo, South Texas, the levels of inequality are quite high. Income is relatively low. There is a relatively high levels of poverty in South Texas, and yet criminality was low. On the other side of the border, criminality was very high. So in the end, just to summarize the results, the main result was that naturally drug activity combined with obviously drug enforcement on the Mexican side being much more active, and above all, lack of law enforcement, as the previous guests just said. There is a culture of impunity. There is very little investigation and prosecution. So the number 1.6% of homicides not have been investigated. This number is comparable with the numbers I found at the time, which for the 5 Mexican cities along the border, depending on the city, we have 0 to 20% of murders that are investigated. Only 0 to 20%.
So your research then you showed that 0 to 20% of murders are investigated, but I understand that you began studying this phenomenon of femicide specifically. Then tell us about that.
Exactly. So the continuation was then to move to femicide because naturally it's a very well-known phenomenon. The advantage point that I had is the database that I could create. So here the original approach was to use data from medical examiners or coroners. So very few people know that in reality the Mexican government has a very nice data bank of causes of death according to medical justification and medical classification. And although the medical examiners, they may be, sometimes they may interact with the police, they many times they're going to do the work quite independently. So I started looking at this data bank and processing the data, and then what I did is I crossed the data exactly with the data that I could obtain from independent sources, such as newspapers and non-governmental organizations, and I realized that the numbers were very, very close. Very, very close. Very few, very little difference. So that gave me confidence that the numbers were good.
So what were some of the key findings then? You went in, you were able to obtain this big bulk of data from coroners in Mexico, in cities along the border. What were you able to extrapolate from that, and how did that compare, say, with similar data in the United States?
Yes, exactly. So this is what was really interesting because naturally, and I'm not by any standard saying that what was just said during the program is wrong. Not at all. The problem of femicide is serious in Mexico and particularly at the border region. But what was interesting to observe is that in reality, those are very, very violent cities, particularly the ones at the border. Those are very violent cities, so there are high rates of homicide in general. So what I did is, okay, let's try to explain femicide using other variables.
And so what were the rates that you found then of killings of women?
Yeah, for example, let me tell you here that for one interesting comparison is Houston against Tijuana. Okay.
Houston, Texas, and Tijuana, Mexico.
Yeah, and it is because Houston is a large city on the American side in Texas, so South States. Tijuana is one large city close to the border. So it's interesting to compare the two. So population Houston 2.1 million people. Tijuana 1.6 million people, a little bit smaller, but big city too. So The interesting number that came right away is that average femicide. Now maybe we need to talk about the definition of femicide here, because for me femicide is the entire it's female homicide.
Right. So these were women victims of homicide then, and so you had specific findings comparing Tijuana and Houston.
Exactly. In that case, for example, average femicide in Houston, 2.4. per year per 100,000 people.
2.4 women per year per 100,000 people in Houston.
Exactly. And in Tijuana, 2.5. So it's basically the same number.
2.5 women per year per 100,000 in Tijuana.
In Tijuana, exactly. That's the average.
So what does this tell us then? If the results between what's considered a very violent Mexican border city and a large U.S. city are similar, what are we to make of that?
The interesting thing here is that it's not violent in Tijuana. Those rates for women are considered very high. But the interesting thing is that in Houston it's also very high. And this is quite surprising.
So in other words,
kind of surprising.
Is part of it just part of the difference in perception? Is there a human element to this in the way people perceive these?
There is a tendency of attributing the problem only to, I'm not saying that's not a problem, but only to, let's say, Mexican culture or the situation of drug traffic. And in reality, the situation of the inner cities in a big city like Houston, it's kind of the same microcosm, if you want. So the same phenomenon is happening there probably, but we are not paying attention. Maybe we are not.
Let me just Stephen Woodman.
I'd be interested to ask what he thinks about the statistics that seem to show that the number of killings have more than doubled in the 5 years following the escalation of the drug war in Mexico. It can be quite complicated when you're talking about statistics to arrive at conclusions, obviously, but I would be interested to find out because
let's turn that to Pedro Albuquerque then. Pedro, we do just have 30 seconds left. Stephen mentioned that there are statistics that show there has been a significant rise in killings since the start of the drug war, killings of women.
In reality, this is very interesting. In reality, it's quite predictable because what happens is there are two phenomena there in place. One of them is that normally when you have a crackdown, law enforcement crackdown, crime rates rise a lot and very fast. So this is the first point. So it's kind of, you can anticipate that happening. And the second thing is that there is a tendency for crime in those cities to clump, to transfer, to go from one city to another, to move from one city to another. So when law enforcement cracks down in one, there is a spike, and then they move it to another city, and then you start to see much more crime in another city.
So in other words, the drug war may in some ways be responsible for this and for spreading it across Mexico.
There is a strong connection.
We're going to have to leave it there as we're out of time. Thank you very much to Stephen Woodman, Pedro Albuquerque, Duncan Tucker for joining us. Global Journalist is a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to all of you for tuning in. Global Journalist executive producer is Joshua Kransberg. Our assistant producers this week are Demi Walls, Lakshna Mehta, Joaquin Hernandez, and Rafaela Ayacovella. Global Journalist studio director is Travis McMillan from RJI, and our audio engineer is Pat Akers of KBIA. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you next time.